Okay, welcome everybody. This is a seminar organized by the Association of Eritrean Studies. My name is Thomas Woldegergis, and I'm one of the organizers of this seminar. The Association of Eritrean Studies is a United States-based association, and it's dedicated for promoting scholarly research on Eritrea and its surrounding regions, and it serves as a forum for scholarly endeavors on issues related to Eritrea. And we also publish this journal, Eritrean Studies Journal, and we publish up-to-date research results and in different fields of study. And the association also organizes forums, conferences, social media events, and that way we try to stimulate and disseminate knowledge about Eritrea and Eritreans. And we also support members by providing a platform for networking opportunities. And as I said, this association is independent, it's non-political, non-sectarian, and it's open, membership is open to anybody who wants to join the association. And we have an official journal. It's called the Eritrean Studies Journal, and it's published with association with the with Red Sea Press. And the journal is peer-reviewed, open access international journal, and we publish papers on original research contributions, review articles, book reviews, and commentaries in different fields of study, including humanities, sciences, technology, public health, and other topics. If you are interested to publish with us, you can submit your manuscripts to eritreanstudieса@gmail.com. And if you have questions about the journal or the requirements for publication, you can talk to us by email on this address. For the last few years, we have done a bunch of stuff in the association and in Eritrean Studies Journal. We have a website, eritreanstudiesa.org, which it has details of what the aims of the association are, its activities and all that kind of stuff. And we have done some membership drive. And as I said, membership is open to anybody interested in the mission of the association. And our source of funding so far is the membership contribution we pay, and there is annual membership of $120 for people in the US, Canada, Europe, and Australia, and it's free for undergraduate students and members from Africa. And we have submitted the manuscripts for the first issue of the journal to the publisher, and the first issue should be out in a few weeks. And again, if you want to publish with us on any topic relevant to Eritrea, you can send your manuscripts to eritreanstudiesa@gmail.com. And one of the things we do is organize seminars like we are having today, and we are honored to have Sheikh Ismael Mukhtar talk to us today on the milestones in the history of Islam in Eritrea. Sheikh Ismael was born and raised in Asmara, and he is a freelance researcher in Islamic and Eritrean history. And he was born in Asmara, and he studied at the University of Manitoba, Faculty of Management, and he is a chartered professional accountant, a CPA, but more important to us today, he is a freelance researcher in Islamic and Eritrean history. And he has published a bunch of articles on both in Arabic and English. And he also has published a book on the history of Islam in Manitoba, Canada in 2021. And his upcoming book with the title Milestones in the History of Islam in Eritrea is coming up this summer. His first book, Manitoba Muslims, is available on Amazon, and you can buy it from Amazon if you are interested. And his upcoming book, Milestones in the History of Islam in Eritrea, is expected this coming summer, and I'm looking forward to reading his upcoming book. And today it's my great pleasure. He's joining us in this forum, and he's going to give us preview of his book and tell us something about the most important milestones in the history of Islam in Eritrea. Before I leave the stage to Ismael, just reminders, we are recording this video and we'll share it with you on YouTube in a week's time or something like that. And we will have a question and answer session at the end. And if you have any questions, you can wait until the end, or you can submit your questions at the chat space, and we'll ask the speaker for you. And if you want to become a member of the Association of Eritrean Studies, you can write your email on the chat space and we'll get in touch with you soon. And please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you want to get updates about upcoming seminars, you can write your email on the chat space and we'll send you the emails. And with that, help me welcome Sheikh Ismael to the stage, and thank you. Sheikh Ismael, welcome. Go ahead and
okay, thank you very much. And it's my pleasure to be part of this wonderful forum, and thank you for the invitation. It's my honor to share with you or introduce to the audience my upcoming book, Milestones in the History of Islam. But before I talk about the book, maybe talk about what prompted me to write this book. I have been living for about more than 30 years in the province of Manitoba in Canada. And on a voluntary basis, I have been involved in the leadership of the local Muslim community, which includes members coming from over 50 countries. And also I've been involved in the interfaith engagements with the Jewish and the Christian communities here. So having been involved for such a long time, some people were all suggesting to me, maybe you should write a book on your experience, on the history of the Muslims in this province. So, driven by that or based on that, I published my first book in 2021 about, Muslims in the province that I live. And after I published that book, somebody sent me a message saying, you wrote something about your adopted country. Well, maybe you should consider writing about your native country. Now, at that time, I did not, think much about, the email and the message that was sent to me. But then I remember the paper that I presented in 2014 in the Eritrean Muslim Convention held in Washington, D.C. So I thought maybe I can take that paper and expand it and try to publish it in a book form. And this is partly driven, of course, by the love of my country. And at the same time, also, I am a passionate reader of history since my teens. I avidly follow and read every aspect related to Eritrean history and Islamic history. Of course, I've been away from my country for a long time, but there is an Arabic saying that says, كم من منزل يألفه الفتى وحنينه أبدا لأول منزل. A person, might be accustomed to any place, but the person will always be, yearning towards the first place he was born. So Eritrea, no matter how far we go or how long we stay away from the country, the love of the country will always be part of us. So I decided then to take this, this undertaking and to write this book. Now, of course, as I started gathering data and doing my research, of course, I came to realize that this is a daunting task for a number of reasons. First, Eritrean history is interconnected with the history of the neighboring countries, with Ethiopia, with Sudan, with Yemen, with Arabia. So trying to carve out the Eritrean history, particularly the Islamic history, would be somewhat a challenging task. So that was, one issue. And the other issue is lack of sufficient resources and references. There are books about Eritrea written from early time, but what's noticeable is most of these books mention, Eritrea passively. So information you have in the history books tend to be very sporadic. A small piece of information here and another small piece in another book. So you have to try to pull all these pieces of information together to produce something that is meaningful. So basically, in my research, I relied heavily on Arabic resources because most of the information available for the period preceding the Portuguese and the Turkish arrival comes from Arabic sources. So for the early part of the arrival of Islam, I utilize the book of Ibn Ishaq, who's a primary source of source of the early Islamic history, which is translated by Golium. It's a huge book. And then there is the book of Al-Tabari, there is a book of Ibn al-Athir, Ibn Sa'ad, and others that provide some useful information about the migration of the companions of the Prophet to Abyssinia, and also the Dahlak and so on and so forth, which I'll be talking about it very soon. And then you have, after that, a period where there is no information. Then around the 9th, 10th century, you have Muslim historians and geographers such as Ibn Hawqal, al-Mas'udi. You find references about the Al-Yaqubi, about the Bija people, about Dahlak, a little bit about Masawa. And I said these are all, small pieces of information here and there. Because mostly they mention these things. For example, they talk about Yemen, okay? And then they spend pages talking about Yemen, but then they reference Dahlak, for example, as maybe a line or two lines. Similarly, when they talk about the Islamic sultanates in Ethiopia, the Makhzumi Sultanate and the Adal Sultanate, the Ifat and the other ones, they go in much detail. So the information you have there, is not rich. You have to basically fill some of the gaps there. So you have these historians, which anyone who writes about this period, usually refer to them. Then we come to the era when the Turks and the Portuguese came. Here you have some resources from the Portuguese, some resources from the Turks, and then you have the huge 16th century rise of Imam Ahmad, which commonly known as Grang. So you have another resource here by Arab Faqih al-Jizani. Then you come to the Italian and British era. Here you have Odorizzi, you have Conto Rossini, lots of books available, and most of them, of course, in Italian, but some of it has been translated to Arabic. And also then you have British officials, Vasquez, you have Longrig, you have also Frederick Nadel, and many others. So it's all over. So it's a struggle to pull together enough information from all the different resources. And then you have also contemporary Eritrean writers. So you have the writing of Sabbe, you have the writing of Nawood, Dr. Jalaluddin, Dr. Bayan, and Dirar, and many others, which is mostly written in Arabic. And then you have the writings of Uqbazgi, Dr. Habta Selassie, Alam Segged, Taghasta Nagashi, and so on and so forth. So that was a long journey to pull all this information together. Now, what is the importance of this book or of this topic, and what's its relevance? Now, in my understanding, and nobody would dispute this at the theory level, Eritrea, is not a Muslim country. It's not a Christian country. It's a country which has, a deep Islamic and Christian tradition. Accordingly, to understand Eritrea, its history, its culture, its social life, we need to have an inclusive understanding. And this is not about being Christian or being Muslim. It's about being an Eritrean. And Eritrea having a dual faith and being a multicultural nation, it's important for us to create a prosperous and tolerant and inclusive society, that we also need to have an understanding of the history in its inclusive nature rather than exclusive nature. So that's one of the objectives I hope to accomplish from this book, is to help in creating this all-inclusive history. I personally, make every effort to read anything, any literature available on the Christian history, because I consider it part of my history. I cannot understand my history without understanding the history of Christianity. I cannot understand my citizens, my neighbors, my co-workers, my friends, if I don't understand the Christian aspect of Eritrean history. So, for example, the book of Samira Habta Mariam on the, I think the title was something Reflections on the History of the Abyssinian Orthodox Church, or other research that was done on the Berbiz and the monasteries. I consider that part of my history that I should know. So I'm hoping through this book to create that broader understanding that, as a Muslim, I don't have only to know the history of Islam or the Christian, not only the history of Christianity, rather understand it in its inclusive nature. Now, unfortunately, most of what's written about the history of Islam is mostly in Arabic. And I'm hoping through this book to help make some of that literature available to the English speakers. Because personally, I feel there is some kind of intellectual gap, and I've written an article about this, where you have lots of writings still coming in Arabic language, and then lots of writings in Tigrinya and in English, and the readers somewhat are segmented, and that's somewhat is not really healthy. So by making all the literature that comes in different language available and is read by Eritrean intellectuals from the different persuasions, we can create a better understanding, better policymakers, better leaders. And when leaders and intellectuals set a good precedent, a good example, then we can hope to create that society, that country, where people think inclusively, where people think of equal opportunity, where people think of fairness, where people are not bigoted or have stereotyping or think exclusively. So that's one of the purposes through this book. I hope some of the literature that's not available in English or Tigrinya hopefully will be available. Now, just to give you an overview of the book itself. So the book begins by discussing, I guess, the first important issue, which is when did Islam arrive in Eritrea? Now, Eritrean Muslims pride themselves by saying that Eritrea and of course Abyssinia was the first place to receive the message of Islam after Mecca. Because what happened was 5 years after Islam came in Mecca, a group of the companions of the Prophet left Mecca and migrated to Abyssinia. Their total number was about 200. There were some who were born there in Abyssinia, estimated to be at about 20. They did not come all at the same time. They came in different waves. The first wave was about 15. So the first place they came was Eritrea, and that's something that Muslims see as a source of pride, that we are the first country to welcome Islam. But at the same time, also, it's a source of pride for Eritreans and Abyssinians in general, that how tolerant and receptive and welcome they were, even though these were not of the same faith. So now there are a number of questions arise here. Where did they land? And one theory is they landed in Massawa, and you have Massawa, the mosque of the Sahaba, which Eritreans believe to be the place where they landed first. Then there is another theory, they landed in Ma'dar, in Denkalia. And then in between comes some people who are driven by nationalistic sentiments, who claim, no, they landed in Sawakin and they went to an area around Khartoum, or you have the Somalis who come and claim that, no, they came through Bab al-Mandab, which are historically questionable. So here again, there is a lengthy discussion about where they landed, and that's something the book tries to address and come to some reasonable conclusion, even though these are things that are difficult to come to a definitive conclusion, because the resources available are limited, and some of them are not clear. For example, the word bada in Arabic, is it Massawa? That's most of the opinions, such as Conte Rossini, say no, it's Massawa. Then you have others who dispute that. They say no, it's not Massawa. It's a different location. So there are those kinds of complications that come into play. And then there is a discussion of whether these companions who came from Mecca, what kind of impact did they live in Eritrea and Ethiopia? Where did they stay? Did they spend all their time in the capital, Aksum? Or were they moving around because they were merchants? Some of them stayed there for 15 years. So were there other people who followed them? Was there a Muslim community that emerged out of that? A lengthy discussion. You have, for example, someone like Tremingham, who would say they did not leave any impact. Basically, after 15 years, the last group, when they left, no trace of Islam was left in the country. Then on the other side, you have Osman Abu Bakr, Eritrean historian, who believes that the Jabarti, the nucleus of the Jabarti community, was established at that time, even though it was small, but that's the time it was established, suggesting that they left behind them a small community of Muslims. So then you have all kinds of discussions here. And then you have another discussion on who they met. Of course, the majority of historians, their understanding is that they met the king of Abyssinia, who in Arabic is known as Ashama, which is at Saham. Now, there is a theory which doesn't seem to be doesn't have to have a strong historical basis, but it's a theory proposed by Muhammad Sa'id Naud, where he said they did not meet the king of Abyssinia, but rather they met a local governor in the highlands of Eritrea and Kabasa. So all kinds of discussions around this area. And this is the starting point in the history of Islam. So the first chapter focuses on this aspect of the history of Islam, how much impact they left, and so on and so forth. And there's, of course, after that comes the the long-running impacts. You have on one side Erlich Haggai, who theorizes based on the idea that the Nagashi, the Negus, according to Muslim historians, accepted Islam, which is disputed by Western historians. So regardless, but there was some implications which he talks about. And then some discussion about some traces, some places that people attribute to the companions. So that's the focus of the first chapter, talking about the first contact of Islam with Abyssinia, with Eritrea, through these companions. And the key question here is, did they leave any trace? Or was it just 15 years they spent, no one came into the fold of Islam, and when they left, no trace of Islam was left. So that is a discussion by itself in the first chapter. Then comes after that, the second chapter that talks about what happened after the death of Najashi. Najashi meaning the king, the friendly king of Abyssinia. Did that friendly relationship continue? Or that relationship basically ended. Now here you have different theories. The Italian historian Ciroli, and I think also Taddese Tamrat, I think they are of the opinion that, yeah, relationship soured after that, and there was attacks by the pirates, and not pirates, but by the Abyssinians on the coastal areas of Arabia. Then you have another theory which disputes that, which sounds to be more stronger, which is proposed by Ashami and somewhat supported by Tremingham, that this was acts of piracy by, some pirates there. They could be from the Bija, they could be from the Danakil, but it was not a state-level attack. And this, of course, has implications, whether it was a state or was it a group of pirates, but it sounds more likely it was driven by a group of pirates. Now, there were a few attempts by the Caliphate to end this movement of piracy, which ultimately led to the arrival of the Umayyad Caliphate in Dahlak, basically a takeover of Dahlak. And from this moment, we see a major change in the history of the region. And the arrival of the Umayyad is considered basically the first permanent station of Islam in Africa. Basically in East Africa. And here comes the rise of the Dahlak Sultanate. So basically, the Umayyad ruled this area for a certain period of time. Then the Abbasid came. After that, there was, decentralization happening because the Abbasid kingdom or empire became so huge that Yemen became somewhat independent. And here again, Dahlak was also becoming more autonomous. And here, the Sultanate of Dahlak came into the surface. And unfortunately, much of the history of Dahlak has probably been lost. But Ollendorff says, if you look at Dahlak today, it's an impoverished island. But he said, surprisingly, in history, there was an amazing civilization in this place. So we know of this Sultanate. It has its own currency. It has its own army. It has its own navy. It has a functional government, and economically it was prosperous. And it was ruled by Al-Mubarak dynasty for almost 200 years. And it had diplomatic relationship with the Fatimids in Egypt, with Yemen, with Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. So a very powerful and prosperous sultanate here. Of course, the sultanate continued until the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century. And after that, of course, the Portuguese, they ravaged the island, and the last sultan basically died after that. So basically after that, Dahlak was, decimated and lost in history. Now, interestingly, there are more than probably 200 or close to 300 funerary stelas that tell us something about Dahlak, and they have been investigated by some European researchers. But interestingly, these ones are scattered all over the world in different museums. Even in the Museum of Bombay, you find something, UK, whatever, and they tell something about Dahlak. And those who did research on them, illustrate that there was a very powerful, prosperous sultanate in Dahlak. So then we can see here, then the beginning, the seeds of Islam was laid in Eritrea through the migration of the companions, and then the permanent stationing of Islam came with Dahlak. And here you have basically Islam being established in the eastern coastal areas of Eritrea. So accordingly, as Sabbe says, that the first Muslims in Eritrea are the Dahlakis, the Danakil, the Saho, who were close to the coastal areas. And then you have also another track, which is the Denkal track. So Denkalia, to cross to Eritrea through Denkalia is much shorter. So you have waves of Yemenis coming through the Denkalia route. And as probably we all know, Eritrea has been a land of immigrants. The last tribe that came to Eritrea, the Rashaida, came in the 19th century. And until 1940s, always there were immigrants coming. Even there was the Jewish community in Asmara estimated to be at 500 at one time. So you have people coming. Eritrea has been a country of immigrants, a country of opportunity, people coming from all the places and all directions. So the political rivalry that was happening in Arabia was driving people towards Eritrea. So you have then the seeding of Islam during the time of the companions, the stationing of Islam after the takeover of Dahlak. So that's what was happening on the eastern coast of Eritrea. Now we go to the north and to the west of Eritrea. So Egypt came under the rule of the Muslim Caliphate early, much before the takeover of Dahlak. And Egypt was ruled previously by the Byzantines. Now the takeover of Egypt had an important historical implication, because the Alexandria Church was found in Egypt. And we know Frumentius, after introducing Christianity to Abyssinia, from that time on, the patriarchs of Abyssinia were always coming from Alexandria. So basically, after the takeover of Egypt, basically the Alexandria Church was under the influence of the Caliphate, or the Egyptian Muslim rulers, which has its own long history. But I'm just mentioning this, that the arrival of Islam in Egypt had far-reaching historical consequences. So you have the Nubian kingdom, which was same like Eritrea and Egypt. They were Coptic Christians, but over time, it was replaced with the Muslim Sultanate of the Fungi Empire. So here you have the Bija tribes, which are spread from Aswan to Massawa. And of course, Bija come from different, they have different sections, but one of the largest ones being Bani Amr, which we are all familiar with. So you have then large Arab tribes migrating to Egypt. And then from Egypt, migrating down to Sudan, to the Bija areas. And one thing that was driving them was the gold, the mineral mines, which is known as Wadi al-Allaqi, the valley of al-Allaqi, which attracted lots and large Arab tribes. And they intermarried with the Bijas. And through that process, Islam spread among the Bija. Of course, it took much longer. It wasn't as fast as it was on the eastern coast. So that's how you see Islam coming to Eritrea through the western and also the northern front. But as I said, it took much longer for Islam to take hold on the north and the west relative to what happened on the eastern side of Eritrea. Now, at the same time, what was happening, so Islam came through Dahlak, it came through Egypt, Sudan, and then in Ethiopia, you have the arise of what's known as the Muslim sultanates, or they call them in Arabic, Al-Tiraz al-Islami, or Al-Mamalik al-Islamiyya. There were 7 of them. Of course, the oldest one, which was discovered by Italian researcher Ciroli, which was in the Showa, the Makhzumi kingdom. So what happened was during the Zagwai, the dynasty time, there was widespread of Islam in eastern Abyssinia. And here you have the rise of different sultanates. So I'm not going into much detail, but then with the Solomonite kingdom, there was a period of very bitter confrontation between these sultanates and the rulers of the highlands of Ethiopia, culminating in the rise of Imam Ahmed, who's commonly known as Grand Ahmed. And Imam Ahmed, of course, he not only took over Ethiopia, but he took the whole Eritrea, so the Sarai region, Hamasin, he reached until the Kassala, Hergigo, even Dahlak, even though in Eritrea he did not stay as long as he did in Ethiopia. But you can see the wide influence of this occurrence in Ethiopia, which had some impact on the spread of Islam in parts of Eritrea. And the conflict that happened after that was the intervention of the Turks and the Ottomans, of course, had its own dimension. Of course, Eritrea, even though it was not the source of that conflict, but Eritrea was also impacted by that. And ultimately, you have the Ottomans basically defeating the Portuguese and taking over Massawa and Hergigo. They ventured into the highlands. They reached the Barba, but they were forced to retreat. So here you have then the rise of the Naib family. The Naib dynasty lasted for a lengthy period of time. Their capital was Hergigo. And at one time, you know, Massawa was considered to be the Zanzibar of the Red Sea. Very well-to-do, very prosperous. It attracted lots of nationalities from all over the world. And it became basically a replacement of the Dahlak Sultanate. So that's also another dimension that's discussed in great length. Now, these are perhaps the main avenues through which Islam came to Eritrea. So the eastern coasts, and then you have Egypt and Sudan, and you have later through Ethiopia. But then who were the main influencers of the message of Islam in Eritrea? So there are 4 influencers that are discussed in the book. The first group is the religious families. So the religious families are many in Eritrea. The Ad Muallim, the Ad Darqi, the Ad Sheikh, the Al Kabir, many of them, which I've extensively talked about them in the book. Now, these were basically religious families who were dedicated to the teaching and to the spread of Islam. And then you have the Sufi orders. Of course, Sufism itself, has a long history, and many dimensions, religious dimension, philosophical dimension. But the Sufism that came to Eritrea was a much simpler Sufism. So you have different orders. In Eritrea, perhaps there were about 6 Sufi orders, the Shaziliya, and then the Ahmadiyya. But the most important Sufi group was the Mirghani, who are known as the Mirghaniya or known as the Khatmiya. Also on the religious family part, the Al-Sheikh were the most influential religious family in Eritrea. Near Massawa, you have the Imberami. That's where you find the mausoleum of Sheikh Nafu'atai, which is one of the highly revered figures from Al-Sheikh. And then you have the Mirghani family. The Mirghani family and the Khatmiya was the most powerful. During the Italian era, basically, they were the de facto representatives of Islam in Eritrea. So you have the leader, Sayyid Hashim, whose mausoleum is, I think, in the area of Hutumla. His daughter, Sayyida Sharifa Alawiya, Ja'far al-Marghani. Again, his mausoleum is also in Karam. Very powerful Sufi order that basically shaped Islam in Eritrea for a lengthy time. I mean, they came around 18 something, and their influence lasted till the Italian era, even after the Italian era. Very powerful and very influential family. So you have the religious family, you have the Sufi orders, and then you have the scholars. The scholars, and typically Eritrean Muslim scholars, they gained their education from Yemen, Zabid. Zabid was the center of learning at that time. Of course, later, mostly they switched after the Egyptians to Al-Azhar. But then you have, this was another third influencer. The fourth one is the merchants. For the longest time in Ethiopia and Eritrea, and basically the Eastern African region, most of the merchants were Muslims. And as Taddis Tamrat mentions, they were very influential. So they did not only carry their business with them, but also the message of Islam. So you have these 4 influencers of Islam: the religious families, the Sufi orders, and then the scholars and the merchants. So there is a chapter that discusses this aspect of influencer of Islam in much detail, in some length. Then I guess another chapter talks about the challenges that Muslims have gone through during the time of King Yohannes. King Yohannes came after the demise of Tedros in Ethiopia. And I guess one of the things that he did was that proclamation that was, in theory, was intended to address some theological differences that existed within the Tewahedo Church, but it ended up, becoming, as Zoda said, instead of doctrinal unification, it turned to be into a religious unification. So basically, Muslims, non-Tewahedo Jews, and Catholics, people who were not of the Tewahedo faith, they were given a certain period of time to abandon their religion or face the consequences. So this chapter talks about how that impacted Muslims, particularly the Jabarti, because the highlands came under the control of Yohannes under Ras Alula. And here the book mentions the how Ras Alula tried to find a middle way between enforcing the order of his master and at the same time also not jeopardizing the commercial life, because he was dependent on the Jabarti community. And according to Erlich Haggai, Ras Alula was not as forceful in terms of enforcing that religious, proclamation of Yohannes in Eritrea. So there is a lengthy discussion on that aspect. Now, before the arrival of the Italians, the situation was dire in Eritrea. So you have on one hand, the Egyptians who were controlling Massawa and Karan and that area. They were in a bitter struggle with the Mahdis. And on one side, they were also in a struggle with Yohannes. And on the other side, you have the Mahdis fighting Ras Alula. So it was a mess. And then you have the Italians encroaching on Eritrea, starting from Denkalia. And with that came the famine, came the drought. So very difficult time. And of course, in the end, Yohannes was killed in the Battle of Matamma by the Mahdis. But even though the Mahdis came as winners, basically the outcome was both lost and the Italians took over Eritrea. Now, of course, Italy, as a colonial power, they discriminated Eritreans. They created a system, a racist system. And we all know the evils of the Italian system. But given what Eritrea was experiencing at that time, all these powers feuding on the Eritrean front, the Italian arrival basically brought some peace to the country and also ended that threat that Muslims were facing of religious persecution by the proclamation of Yohannes. So that's a chapter that's discussed with some detail. Then comes the Italian occupation and the British administration arrival. Here there was a new momentum created, a new momentum that was driven by three elements. One is the relative free environment that was created by the British administration. And before that, the Italians, they were trying to appear to be the champions of Islam for their own interests, especially after Mussolini, who at one time called himself the sword of Islam because, they had issues in Libya and issues in Somalia. So they were trying to appear to be champions of Islam. So there were some leeways given to Muslims, and they contributed, for example, in the building of the Al-Khulafa al-Rashidin mosque in Asmara, the largest mosque in Eritrea. And then you have the British era where there was more freedom, more openness. So with that free environment, and then you have a large segment of scholars who graduated from Al-Azhar. My estimate is probably at that time, there were at least 50 scholars, Eritrean scholars, who graduated from Al-Azhar. And Eritrea probably in all its history, it hasn't seen this number of scholars at one time. In addition to that, there were also the Azhar mission, which included about 16 Egyptian scholars. So you have a large segment of scholars, a free environment, and then you have lots of wealthy Muslims from the Yemeni Hadramis and the Jabartis. So that led to the rise of various Muslim institutions. So this was a period which I call period of Muslim resurgence. So, and with that came the centralization. So the first mufti of the country was appointed during this time. Courts were organized at this time. Many schools, Islamic schools, open at this time. So there was a clear resurgence of Islam. Of course, there was also a shift of power from the Mirghanis to the institutionalized, religious leadership in the form of the Dar al-Ifta and in the form of the schools and so on and so forth. So this happened within a difficult period in the history of Eritrea, where Eritreans have to determine their future. So here came in the 40s situation where Eritreans suddenly found themselves in a free environment where they can talk about their future. And so you have newsletters coming and all kinds of debating taking place. Now, there was a positive start here when the Mahbar Fiqh Hagar emerged. And of course, there are many discussions about whether Mahbar Fiqh Hagar was a political body or was it a civic organization, regardless of what. But the good thing about Mahbar Fiqh Hagar was it brought the intellectual leadership of Muslims and Christians together. So it was a good start of building a national consensus. But what happened after that, basically, that process was sabotaged by external interferences, where basically the sectarian divide, unfortunately, took place in Eritrea with far-reaching consequences. And it's very interesting that Travascus, when he talks about the Bet Girgis conference, he says if Eritreans were left on their own, they would have been able to reach to some kind of national consensus. So heavy interference from the Ethiopian government, from the British, and unfortunately also the involvement of the clergy made things difficult to create that national consensus. So you have during this time some unfortunate sectarian violence is happening. But what's also interesting, as Adam Sagged Tesfaye mentions in his book, that the Eritreans, despite all these difficulties they were having, they're having, their leadership was wise enough that they were able to intervene quickly before these kinds of conflicts escalate, because the Shifta and the other powers, they were trying to create as much wedge between Muslims and Christians and turn the country into a blood bath. So the Lamsegga points that the leaders were clever enough to intervene and put the fire quickly. And he said that's an example that can be set for other nations to follow. So certainly a difficult time, followed by, of course, the annulling the federation, and what comes after that, long policy of discrimination and so on and so forth. So basically the book has about 8 chapters. And as I said, this book is for all. And my hope from publishing this book is not to write a sectarian history, rather to contribute to an inclusive understanding of Eritrea, that Eritrea in its history, in its tradition, its social life is deeply ingrained in Christian Islamic tradition. And both Muslims and Christians need to understand this history. And with the more we have an inclusive understanding, the better future we can hope for Eritrea. So I think I've spoken enough, and I will stop here. Any comments or questions you have, I will try to answer them as much as I can. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. This was great. Yeah, thank you. And if you have any questions, then I will call you one by one. Okay. Hussein Bashir, you can go ahead, unmute yourself and go ahead. Anybody? Any questions? Okay, Marco, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Ismael, for that wonderful synopsis of the history of Islam in Eritrea. So my question is, why did the 200 plus, what do you call them? Like, are they pioneers? I forgot the term you used. Anyways, why did they move from Saudi to Eritrea? What was the driving force?
Well, so I guess your question is about those companions of the Prophet who migrated, who came to Abyssinia. Okay, so what happened basically was after Prophet Muhammad announced his prophecy and started preaching Islam in Mecca, of course, the Meccans who were pagans, they vehemently opposed the message of Islam, and they started persecuting people, torturing them, and trying to forcefully prevent them from accepting Islam. So the situation became difficult and dire. So at that time, the Prophet told his companions, migrate to the land of Abyssinia. It's a land that's ruled by a king who's just, and a king who nobody under his domain will be treated unjustly. So that was one of the driving reasons why they migrated from Mecca to Abyssinia, because they were under persecution. Now, of course, there are many discussions as to why Abyssinia was chosen, but as the historian Al-Tabari mentions, Meccans traveled frequently to Abyssinia for business. Tabari says that it was a place they regularly came and they made good profit. So it was a place where there was active commercial business relationship. So persecution was one of the main reasons.
Okay, Dr. Tesfa, go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I apologize if there are points which I haven't heard because I was trying to, I had some difficulty connecting with you given other overlaps. So that's my apology. So if it is covered, please tell me, read the book. But if I just want to take a point where, does the book cover what was the religious history of this region in terms of having the Judaism being the main religion on both sides of the Red Sea? Does the book from there therefore mention on how when Christianity was coming, there were times where Abraham al-Habashi would even go with King Caleb, would go to Mecca or to Yemen, up to Mecca even, and to restore the Christian dominance or the Christian rule over the Judaic rebellion. The central point of that being that below, south of Byzantine, the land that we call Eritrea today, Habasha including, was a rule that influenced, that has a sway up to beyond the Red Sea, up to the Yemen. I think I heard you saying also when Christianity came, the Church of Alexandria was the center, and therefore there was in Nubia, then Abyssinia, and therefore there is a belt of Christianity, and therefore it's during this time, almost few years after King Caleb and Abraham would reach to Mecca, and including beyond Yemen, that Muhammad emerges. Therefore, the connection with followers of Muhammad, therefore, would be linked to this, to say these were people who were there as peacemakers, as rulers, as powerful, influential Christians. So from that, therefore, does this book, therefore, give a glimpse of that Christianity was quite spread on both sides of the Red Sea, and today's Eritrea or Abyssinia was a key part of that. Does the book cover this area? And the other point which I would ask is, do you also link to what type of commerce? I think you mentioned it, that Islam was spread to the community by merchants as well. would you know that some of these merchants or the merchandise which was taking place or the commercial activities, mainly from Massawa to the hinterland of Abyssinia, did also include slavery, because Arab slavery was one of the oldest, and it did affect our communities, and we were at least transition to that. So does it cover these issues along those? If you have covered it, just tell me to read the book, but I just felt I would mention.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, the focus of the book is the post-Islamic era, meaning that what happened, with the invasion of Abraha and even the prior migration of the Sabaeans to Abyssinia. So that part is not, is not in the scope of the book. The book basically begins with the migration of companions from Mecca to Abyssinia. But having said that, there are some mention of some, aspects of what happened at that time, but not in great length. In terms of the commercial activities, of course, again, the focus here in the book is more on the religious aspect, but definitely Dahlak was an important center of trade. Massawa was an important center of trade. Slavery was part of it, as mentioned in the books of history. But again, the book does not go in much detail about it because, as I said, the focus here is on the religious aspects of the history, not the commercial aspect. If commerce is mentioned here, it's mentioned in the context of its impact on the spread of the message of Islam in Abyssinia and also in Eritrea.
Okay, thank you. Next, Ismail. Salahuddin, Salahuddin, go ahead. Unmute yourself and ask your question. Salahuddin? We cannot hear you.
Hear me now. What about? Hello.
Hello, Salahuddin, go ahead.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
Okay, I think we'll go to the next person. Saad Musa, please go ahead. Saad Musa, can you hear me?
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Brother Ismail, thank you very much. Very interesting story. When the companions came, they say they came through Massawa, which is the Ras Midr area where we have Masjid al-Sahaba now. Is there any archaeological sites that tells us something about that? Because at the time, I guess, Adulis was the vibrant city on the Red Sea coast. And I don't know if Massawa has existed even to the best of my knowledge. but Adulis was the place, the city, almost has a worldwide trade over there, the Egyptians, the Romans, you name it. So do we have any archaeological findings regarding the coming of the early Sahabas to Massawa? And then now the other question is, if Nagashi was the king in Aksum at the time, how come his mausoleum where he died is not in Aksum? It is in
At Dogri.
Okay, that place where there is his body is rested there.
Yeah.
And again, he is not buried alone, I believe. He's buried with some others in the same mausoleum that they have there. And all because we could see the names and some Quranic verses there, and also we see that there is another church nearby, the Kaddach church, his wife probably, which means the guy was he a Muslim? Yeah. Was he going to Mecca, to Arabia? That's why he left Aksum and he was assassinated or killed, whatever, over stuff like that. Another interesting thing is Alula. Alula, as you mentioned, it was very liberal when it came to the laws of Johannes. Even Menelik on the other side was not serious as much as Johannes was, because if you remember, even they spoke nicely with Hagos Muhammad Ali, Liji Iyasu's father, and they told him, you know, kind of declare, you know, that you are a Christian and things will be okay, and he marries the daughter of Menelik and all that. This is to keep, you know, the society together from Menelik's point of view. And Alula has also a Muslim minister of trade, the one who was going to Massawa and back. And when I visited the museum that we have in Maqale, I think it is of Johannes IV Museum, basically it is a museum of crosses, very interesting collection of crosses there. But you see a picture for Alula there, dressed the way the Saudis, sultans or whatever, dress. The ugal, he has the ugal, he has, it was fascinating because for us, Alula was, you know, was so much an enemy of anything non-Abyssinian or non-Tigrayan or non-Habasha. How come he said this guy is dressed in this way? And I asked the museum guide, I told him, wow, the guy must have been so friendly with the focus on the other side of the Red Sea, since he is dressed in ugal and just like any Arab or Muslim man. No, he told me, this is funny, he told me, no, the culture here at the time was when somebody kills a lion, he makes out of the lion's skin a dress. And probably this is people he defeated that he made, he's been dressed like, it didn't make sense to me because they were not dressed in a skin. It was just the normal fashion. So what do you say on all these points? And thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the port of arrival, as I said, this is an issue of great controversy. There is no conclusive evidence to definitively say that this was the spot, okay? Archaeological studies, I am not aware of any studies in this nature, but there is a widespread belief among Eritreans, Eritrean Muslims, that that particular spot where there was the spot that they landed there the first time, there is a mention that, there is a narration mentioned by one historian known Ibn Asakir, where one of the companions said that we will be landing in Bada, which is the old name of Massawa. According to some historians, as I mentioned, there is difference of opinions on whether Bada was this Massawa or not. Now, in terms of Adolis, Adolis was in a phase of decline when the companions migrated to Abyssinia. After Abyssinia's attempt to take Yemen and also Abraha's venture in Mecca, Abyssinia went into a phase of decline. So Aksum was in decline, and Adolis as a port was also in a state of decline. So it would not be surprising that, and of course at that time, Massawa was disconnected with the mainland. So if they landed, as commonly believed, then maybe they might have landed there, and then they took another boat to the mainland. But as I said, this is an issue of, we cannot say definitively. There are many issues in history that cannot be said definitively. So, but it is a common belief. In terms of the grave of Najashi, which is believed to be his grave, this grave is mentioned in the annals of Arab Faqih al-Jazani, who accompanied the Imam Ahmad in the 16th century. So it's an old one. Now, the common belief is that he is buried there, and that definitely raises some question. The Ethiopian writer Abdul Samad says, how is it possible that when the capital is Aksum, he would be buried in this place and not in the, as you would expect, would be buried along with the other kings? So that's a question that could be, debatable. But at the same time, also, if that could also be feasible, because historically we know graves are, moved from one place to another place. So possible, like the Hussein grave in Cairo, there is no definitive, evidence that happened, but still it's widely believed that part of his body was buried in that place. So, as I said, there are many areas in early histories that cannot be definitively said. But there are 15 companions who are buried in that place. And these 15 companions, they are known by name. The historian Ibn Ishaq, Ibn Hisham, all of them mentioned them. So there were about 15 who died in Abyssinia, and they were buried in that place. Of course, the Turkish government took interest, and they renovated the mausoleum, they built a mosque, and so on and so forth. So that in terms of that grave. In terms of Ras Aluda, the Westerns who met him, they say that he was more tolerant and more open towards Muslims than his master, Yohannes. And as you mentioned, some of his close advisors, the Negadres, was a Muslim. And so some of them would interpret that in two ways. One, they say because he needed Muslims at that time because they were the merchants. So he had, to keep the commercial life going, he need to have relationship with the Naibs of Massawa. So they said that was driven by commercial interest. Others say that he was more tolerant and more open-minded. Now, having said that, Alula does have a troubling history when it comes to the tribes of Habab, to the tribes of Saho, to the tribes of the lowlands, where he was raiding those areas constantly. And that's why there is a lot of bad memory about him. And at the same time, also the people of Kabasa did not accept him. So, Rasul de Mikael, he fought against him for a long time. Bahta Hagos fought against him a long time. So that history is there. So the fact that he was more lenient than his master does not, should not be seen positively all the way. There are other troubling aspects of the history of Ras Aluda.
What's your comment when? And what's your comment regarding his picture in a Saudi dress or Guftan?
I don't have any comments on that one. I haven't seen the picture, so
Okay, thank you.
Just one last question on Massawa. You know, there is Masjid Hamal in Massawa.
Yeah.
And they say that was the first church in Africa was established there, they say. And matter of fact, when I did visit the masjid, it is for the Sufi folks nowadays, the way it is built, it is not a traditional mosque, because it has a lengthy one. And masajid usual, as you know, they have circular large areas. But this one seemed to me, you know, very typical of a church architecture, where it is a slender. And so do we know anything about Masjid Hamal? Thank you.
Well, I guess Massawa has some of the oldest mosques in Eritrea. And Odorizi, in his book on Massawa, he talks about these mosques. For example, the Hanafi mosque is believed to be 800 years. The Shafi'i mosque, maybe even more than that, according to Miran. So many mosques in Massawa. Now, the Hamal Masjid is also one of the old mosques. Now, the belief is that it was a mosque, and when the Portuguese came, they transferred that to a church, and then after the defeat, it went back to a masjid. From my recollection, I think that's what Sabbe mentioned in his book on the history of Eritrea.
Thank you. Gabriel, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead, Gabriel. Hello, Gabriel, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Sheikh Ismail, for your wonderful presentation. And we look forward to the book. It undoubtedly will contribute to the literature on Eritrea. My question is, I was working on a project dealing with alternate dispute resolution. And for that, I was dealing with the traditional laws that we call Hagindaba. And as an alternative also, I considered the Quranic laws. And a friend of mine who is a Muslim commented that I shouldn't mix the Quranic laws with the traditional laws because it's faith-based. And I was taken aback. I can understand what he's saying. But at the same time, as an alternative to the civic laws, it is an important alternative governing the large section of the population. What do you think? What is your views on that?
Well, I guess historically in Muslim communities, there was always some sort of a judicial process based on the Islamic Sharia, and you always had somebody who took the role of a qadi. So this structure has been there even way before Italians, among the Saho tribes, among the lowland Bani Amr tribes. And there are in fact certain tribes that were known for producing judges or qadis. So you have that aspect. Now that was complemented by what's known as Qanun al-Urfi, or the custom-based law, which was administered by the elders and so on and so forth, such as determining, for example, issues related to compensation and so on, or tribal disputes. So you have that parallel at the same time. And then when the era of institutionalization came, then you have these formal Islamic courts on one side, and then you have the civic courts. And there was an attempt during the time of federation to collect the custom-based rules. But by and large, when it comes to family matters, when it comes to inheritance, to business transactions, mostly it was based on the Sharia law. Now, if we talk about the difference, of course, in the Muslim belief, the Sharia law is part of revelation. The custom law comes with tradition and with generational transmission. So it is viewed differently. And maybe that's where your friend is coming from.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Now I see there is a written question here. I don't know if you have seen it.
Yeah, I'll go to Kifle first, then I'll go to that written question. Kifle, go ahead, please. Dr. Kifle.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have a couple of questions. One is, you talked a lot about the movement of people to different places. I was wondering whether the book will also contain civilizations that these people brought along, be it in literature, be it in medicine, be it in agriculture, or be it in governance and administration and so on and so forth. That would have made it very much richer. And the second question is, according to the title of your presentation, you mentioned milestones. I would like to hear from you, what are the turning points or the milestones that you could identify that things would have been different if that didn't happen? Thank you.
Okay, in terms of the first question about, the migration movement to Eritrea and the people who were coming to Eritrea, what they brought with them, maybe that's something that was touched very quickly, but I said, as I said, the focus of the book has been on the spread and the transmission of the mission of Islam. So not much from my recollection, or it is not covered in great detail. Now, in terms of your second question, in terms of the milestones, yeah, the chapters are organized along those lines. For example, the migration of the companions, that was one milestone. The arrival of the Umayyad in Dahlak, that was another milestone. The takeover of Egypt by the Caliphate, that was a milestone, even though the impact was not immediate. In terms of Dahlak, the impact was immediate, but the impact of the Egyptian takeover was not immediate, but generationally, it was very, very significant. Also, the arrival of the Portuguese, or the rivalry between the Portuguese and the Ottomans, that was also an important milestone, which brought the presence of the Ottomans, and then the rise of the Naib family, the rise of the Sufi orders, particularly the Khatmiya order. This is another milestone, and so on and so forth. So the chapters mainly are organized along these milestones.
I guess I wasn't looking for the sort of outline of the chapters, but rather could be maybe the definition of milestone. To me, milestone is a turning point that things would have been different if those didn't happen. So those are major historical turning points in the history of either the country or the people.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm looking for.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that's at least in my understanding. the companions of the Prophet, if that did not happen, perhaps the course of history would have been different. If the Umayyad did not arrive in Dahlak, probably the course of history would have been different. Same thing with Egypt. So at least in my point of view, from my point of view, they were important historical events, but at the same time also they were shapers of the history in the long run.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question related to what Professor Kflay was asking. He was asking if there were any impacts in the culture, literature, and stuff like that you can cite for Muslims for the spread of Islam in Eritrea. What I'm thinking now is, for example, the impact of the evangelical missionaries from Sweden who came to Eritrea in the 1800s. Mm-hmm. And one of the significant things they did to Eritrean culture is translation of the Bible into Tigrinya. They basically made the Tigrinya language what it is today. Mm-hmm. And do you consider something similar to that? I'm sure the introduction of Arabic to Eritrea is related to Islam, and do you see something significant like that?
Well, I guess in terms of, there is a section that talks about the process of the Islamization and Arabization of Eritrea. And here there's a discussion on how the Arabization in Eritrea was somewhat different than Sudan. For example, in Sudan, vast regions of Sudan, basically Arabic language became the de facto language of the country. Now, that did not happen at the tribal level in Eritrea, but what happened was Arabic became the intellectual language of Eritrean Muslims. So whatever literature available, whatever inscriptions are available from those regions, for example, Dahlak or Massawa, it's all documented in Arabic. So basically Arabic became the intellectual language of Eritrean Muslims for a long time. And that's why you don't find these local languages written, or they don't have a written form. They are all, they exist in oral form. So, yeah.
Okay, that's good. Yeah, thank you. And Ephraim, go ahead. Ephraim, unmute yourself and go ahead, please.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Sorry.
We can hear you, yes, go ahead.
Let me see I don't know if you see the camera too. I'm not sure. I turned it on. Okay. Anyway, a very good presentation. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I learned a lot today, but just a few quick questions, a couple of quick questions. One is, in your presentation, you were mentioning about events and dynasties or leadership and all that kind of stuff. But does your book also include writing of like the years that you're talking about? So in your presentation you didn't mention any years and stuff. So if you say Italian and all that stuff, so I know enough about that, or British administration, but in earlier generations it may be difficult.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, good.
Everything has a year. Yeah.
Okay, so the second question is mainly we live in a time of conflicts and fighting and exclusiveness and that kind of stuff. In terms of back in Eritrea, and I'm not asking any specific dates and stuff, was the community work, living in peace together for most part? Was there a lot of confrontational? I know you mentioned about Johannes and Alula, how one was more tolerant than the other. But in general, though, was there a fairly respectful coexistence? Because when you look at today, it's scary. The world is turning into. That's basically my question, and thank you very much.
Well, I guess that question is answered by Osman Sabbe in his book when he said that religious tension was introduced to Eritrea by the Portuguese and the Turkish rival, or it's foreign to Eritrea. Now, if we look at the relationship between the Bahr Nagasi in Dubarwa and the Naibs in Hergigo, we find that they had a very positive relationship, and according to some historians, they shared the tax that was collected by the Naib, and Naib also had some ownership in the highlands. So Domicelli, one of the researchers, he says that basically when the foreign hands were off, the two most important, political entities at that time, the Naib and the Bahr Nagasi, they had a positive communal relationship. So technically speaking, we don't live in an ideal world. And when we talk about these things, we talk in relative terms. So talking in relative terms, definitely the Eritrean history takes a different course than the kind of history that we read about during, for example, the Solomonide time in Ethiopia and the tense relationship between the highlanders and the Muslim Sultanate. So I would say overall it was positive history that should make Eritreans somewhat be proud of it.
Thank you. There is a question from Bob, and he's asking if the conversion of Sudanese and Eritreans into Islam involves force or something like that.
Okay. Now, if we talk about Sudan itself, of course, one of the leading authors on the subject of the spread of Islam is Thomas Arnold, a well-known British historian. He has a book called Preaching to Islam. It's an extensive research. And he talks about the fall of the Nubian kingdom, which was similar to Abyssinian. Abyssinians was Orthodox Tawahdo Christian. Now, according to him, it failed for various reasons, no particular reason, including internal feuds, including large wave of migrants and so on and so forth. So, but when it comes to Eritrea, Eritrea does not have, at least from what I have found, a history of forced conversion. As I said, the influencers of Islam in Eritrea were merchants, scholars, Sufi orders, and the religious families. It was all grassroots driven and mostly peaceful. I haven't seen any forced conversion per se in terms of the Eritrean history.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Anybody has any questions?
Can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
2 points there. One is the Egyptian policy, especially after the new king has come. Do you know that there was a policy of clear Islamization, where with the discovery of the potential of the Nile, the ambition of the Egyptian king, the new king after the Ottomans, was to control the whole Nile basin. And as part of that, therefore, there were two principles which he followed of conquering that whole land. One is under one religion and one language, Arabic. And therefore, there are people who would say
We are breaking up, Dr. Tesfan.
Of producing these cadres.
So I guess my understanding is you're talking about Muhammad Ali Pasha, the founder of the dynasty that continued till 1952 when the Egyptian revolution happened and the Farouk was overthrown. So Muhammad Ali Pasha originally was a commander from Albanian origin, a very ambitious man. And I mean, he was driven more by, mostly imperialistic ambitions more than religious. Of course, I mean, Egyptians were in control of Massawa and Karan, and probably at a later time. But that policy or that ambition of creating a large Egyptian empire, of course, drove him to taking over the Sudan and bringing an end to the Fungi Sultanate. And then, of course, there were confrontations with Johannes, as is, from history. There were 2 wars, no, in fact, 3 wars between the Egyptians and the Johannes army, in which the Egyptians lost, very badly. And of course, according to a letter by King Johannes himself, one of the instigators to this was Munzinger Pasha, who was a Swiss governor of Karan on behalf of the Egyptians. So yeah, there was that kind of dream on the part of Muhammad Ali Pasha and his children to expand that empire, which failed, and Johannes managed to defeat the Egyptians in 3 occasions. Of course, they were successful just in one venture through the port of Zayla and then taking Harar. But on the Eritrean and Abyssinian front, that project did not go anywhere.
Okay, thank you. Mahari, go ahead. Mahari.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Sheikh Ismael. Looking forward for your book. So maybe it's mentioned in your book, or maybe if you could highlight to my question, with this historical phenomenon that you just described, is there any relationship with the Islamic influence in Europe, where, in Spain and Portugal, where there was a lot of economic civilization influence about, the 9th and 10th century? I happened to be in Andalusia at some point. It has been a while, but you see a lot of strong presence of economic influences from the. I didn't know the difference between the Arabization and Muslim expansion. Maybe sorry for my lack of knowledge, but how would you relate the Muslim influence or involvement in our region compared to what was happening in Europe around that time? Thank you.
Well, I guess in terms of Andalusia, which historically includes the whole Iberian Peninsula, including Portugal and Spain. So the Muslim presence there, lasted for centuries. If you combine, the kingdom of Granada, you're talking about 8 centuries. And of course, there is a lengthy discussion in terms of the impact of the Muslim presence in Spain. But then, of course, things change with the rise of, the Queen Ferdinand and Isabella and so on. So a long history. Now, I guess, was there any impact of that civilization in terms of Eritrea? One thing, I guess, that is noticeable, that some of the people whose names were found in the funerary stelas in Dahlak came from that region. And one of the judges in Dahlak at one time was also from that region, from Al-Andalus. So, you know, that perhaps shows us the far-reaching relationship of Dahlak as a commercial hub, and also perhaps some people who came from that region. Now, if we were to do a comparison, I guess, you know, definitely Andalus was much sophisticated in terms of its civilizational output. I mean, according to some researchers, the European Renaissance began from Andalus. So, from my perspective, I guess the cores are going to different routes. Okay.
Thank you. Anybody has any questions? Saad, do you have questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Just a follow-up on this question that was presented by the previous brother. Briefly, the Portuguese and the Ottoman Empire, that conflict on the Red Sea at the time, has also to do with the conflict between the, in bracket, the Muslims and the Christians of Ethiopia at the time, or of Abyssinia. And so even the Portuguese came to support the Christians, I believe, in Ethiopia. And so they used to call the Muslims of Ethiopia at the time the Moors. And this is the name which was given to the Andalusians, or the Muslims of Spain at the time. Now, if you could briefly tell us when did they come and how did this thing ended up, the Portuguese come into the Red Sea? But mainly my question is on Imam Ahmad Ibrahim Mukhtar. What is the latest scholarship on the status of Imam Mukhtar? Was he a liberator or a colonizer? Thank you.
Okay, so I guess in terms of the Portuguese or European contact with the Ethiopian leadership, I mean, that began earlier than the arrival of the Portuguese in the Red Sea. Now, the Portuguese arrived in the Red Sea before Imam Ahmad, and there was a bitter rivalry between them and the Ottomans, the new power. In fact, the Portuguese, before the Ottomans, they were in conflict with the Mamluks who controlled Egypt. But then the coming of the Ottomans and their takeover of Egypt, then that created a new power. And there was a lengthy struggle, and the Portuguese managed to, for example, to take some areas in Yemen. Mecca and Medina was also under threat. So a long history of conflict between the two. Then I guess the rise of Imam Ahmad, known as Grand, that created a new dimension where the Ethiopian king Libna Dingle, as he found the forces of Ahmad were basically taking his domain, and he was basically on the verge of collapse. At the advice of his, I think, mother, he called on the Portuguese to help him. So the Portuguese came to help. I think it was the son of Vasco da Gama, who was leading the force, and then Imam Ahmad, he also asked for the help of the Turkish, who sent a force through Denkalia. So you can see both forces trying to support one party, and of course we know what the outcome was. I mean, ultimately Imam Ahmad was killed. I guess your question is, what is his status in history? I guess these things has to be seen within their historical context. I mean, Imam Ahmad's invasion did not just come out of the blue. There has been a long history of bitter struggle between the Solomonite kingdom and the Islamic sultanates, the seven that was mentioned by historians such as al-Maghrizi. So there was a long bitter struggle, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And in these struggles, religious places were not respected, whether mosques or churches or Bibles or Quran or religious figures. So unfortunately, it was a long, bitter blood.
I'm sorry.
A long, bitter history that unfortunately, had some dire consequences to both Muslims and Christians.
Okay. Mohammed, can you go ahead, unmute yourself, Mohammed Bashir, unmute yourself and go ahead.
Very good. Thank you very much, Ustaz Ismail. Really, first, I don't really have a question.
Go ahead, Mohammed. We cannot hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, very good. Thank you. First, I guess my first is my appreciation and thank Mr. Ismail for his wonderful work in this book. I have read your previous book on the Manitoba Muslims. Very well done, and inshallah, we're looking forward for this book also. One maybe always kind of bothers me is this book is, of course, we've seen other books done also on Eritrea, on the, I guess, focus being the Muslims in Eritrea at this point, not having access to maybe some scholarship from the country. What impact do you think it may have had to your work in working on this book, Mr. Ismail? Thank you.
Okay, so I guess if I understand your question correctly, I think you're talking about Eritrean scholarship on this subject from Eritrea itself. Now, if that's, if my understanding of your question is correct, I think that's an area, that needs to be explored further. Because, 30 years of war and, whatever circumstances that came after that have not created an environment where, when you're struggling to survive, then you don't have much time to go into thinking into this area. So even though there is a commendable effort on this area, there are many writings that have not seen the light yet. Where they are and how accessible they will be, that's another discussion by itself. For example, it's mentioned that Yassin Batouk, which was the editor of Sawt al-Rabata, a very important figure in the 40s, during the 40s, has a book or written a book about the history of, I think the title was Fusulun min Tarikh wa Shu'ub Eritrea, chapters in the history of Eritrea and its people. But you don't know where that book is. Similarly, Adam Seged mentions that Umar Qadi has many writings. So the question is, yeah, definitely there are many missing components of that scholarship, and hopefully, in the future, there will be more fields, study. There will be more resources available, and the search has not ended yet.
Thank you. We'll ask a few more questions and we'll let you go. We have Kifli for a long. So Kifla, please go ahead. Unmute yourself and go ahead. Kifla, can you hear me? Okay, we'll go to Gabriel. Please go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead, please. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. You probably know in the highland Eritrea, there are pockets of villages that are inhabited by people who are Muslims. And I was wondering, were these people converted to Islam, or were they transported from other regions? Do you have any idea, or do you know how that happened?
Okay. Well, I guess there are two factors here. One is a factor of conversion, and the second one is a factor of migration. And these two factors, had an important role in the spread of Islam in Eritrea. So you have communities that migrated and influenced local people, and local people who converted to Islam. Now, in terms of the Muslims in the highlands of Eritrea, you have on one hand the Saho, which are on the Kalaguzai side, and then you have the Jabartis, the majority of them being in the Sarai, but you have also Jabartis in Hamasin and Kalaguzai. Now, one of the theories that historians such as Uthman Abu Bakr and others propose is that the Jabarti Muslim community emerged with the migration of the companions. And the belief is that the companions, when they came and migrated to Abyssinia, they were able to disseminate the message of Islam. And when they left, there was a small community of Muslims remaining in this part of the world, which came to be known as the Jabarti. So, and then of course, there was always movement of people. That was the history of Eritrea, people coming from the south, from the north. Basically, it's kind of mobile population, even though the highland was more stable. But definitely, there was a factor of conversion, and there was a factor of migration.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? Mahari, go ahead. Mahari?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to ask you one philosophical question. And it made me to think deep, as you say, that the Eritrean population was a mobile population. What do you mean by that? Is it really based on demographic distribution, or is it just based on legends or stories? And I think you're choosing that word carefully, which that's a good thing to hear. Like, I've never heard it as you're describing as it's a mobile population.
Well, I mean, in a sense, you, for example, the founders of the Abyssinian kingdom are believed to be the Sabaeans who came from Yemen, and then you have, continuously migrants coming to Eritrea, and then you have movement of people, for example, the Bija, who took over the highlands at one time, and some of the highlanders, even though today they speak Tigrinya and they are Orthodox Christians, some of them still trace their ancestry to the coming of the Bija to the highlands. And then you have all theories about Bilain and the relationship with the Ago in Ethiopia, whether they migrate. So the whole history is, you see people moving around. And another factor was also war. Unfortunately, there were raids, there were invasions, attacks, and so on. So people were back and forth. So it was a population that was characterized definitely by or shaped by, to a certain extent, migration. And of course, the people in the lowlands were mostly nomadic, even though the people in the highlands were mostly sedentary. So yeah, migration was definitely an important factor, and internal movement is something that historically we know about it, and there is nothing called pure race. The people have intermarriages, they intermingle, and they have lived together side by side for centuries.
So do you think this was more influenced by, because Eritrea is close to the sea? Because you'd see this, a lot of mobile populations or a lot of intermarriages in Western, Africa, like, Senegal and all those port bases. I don't know if that is.
Yeah. Yeah, being on the close to the sea was definitely a factor. And Arabia was basically, if you look at Eritrean history, until the 1950s, Eritrea was a land that people came to settle, to prosper. It was a country that welcomed people. Now, unfortunately, the reverse happened after that, where you see this is the opposite. It's an opposite trend in history. Historically, from the early time we know, people have been flocking to Eritrea. Of course, some of them stay in Eritrea, some of them move to Ethiopia. But I would say historically, Eritrea has been a land of opportunity, and you have people who coming empty-handed and becoming the wealthiest in Eritrea. So I think there is that positive aspect, but unfortunately, that history has been reversed now in a complete opposite way.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have kept our speaker for too long. Please, we should wrap it up and finish here today. Please join me in thanking Sheikh Ismail for a wonderful, excellent seminar today. Thank you so much, Ismail, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And if you want to hear more about upcoming seminars, write your emails on the chat space and I'll email you about upcoming seminars, and I think we'll finish it here. Thank you, Ismail.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We learned a lot. This was great, and we are looking forward to your book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.